Hey everybody, welcome to the Always So podcast, a production of Willwood's Faith in Marriage. This is Dr. Mario Sacasa, and I pray that this episode finds you having an amazing day today. Happiness. What makes it possible for some to possess it without much effort, and why is it that others just can never seem to attain it? Joining me on the show today to talk about happiness is Dr. Charles Nemeth, professor and director of criminal justice, law, and ethics at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and author of the book, Finding Happiness in a Complex World. In today's episode, we discuss how faith impacts happiness, what St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle have to say about the topic, the trappings of celebrity and temporal pleasures, the importance of living life from a full understanding of the human worth and dignity, why relativism and deconstructivism lead to despair, virtue's role in happiness, and what positive psychology has to say about it. If you find this show helpful, please leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts, or simply just share with one other person who you think would benefit from it. Again, if you want to join the conversation, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. But let's get into this episode with Dr. Charles Nemeth. Dr. Charles Nemeth, welcome to the Always So podcast. How are you doing today?
Very good, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm grateful to have you on the show. Thank you for the work that you've done putting this book together, Finding Happiness in a Complex World. And I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have today. And so the question I have for you right out of the gates is this. I've read a lot in terms of happiness from a psychological perspective, and we'll talk a little bit about Martin Seligman's work with positive psychology and learned optimism and a lot of the research that's out with regards to happiness. But you're not a psychologist. You're coming at this as a lawyer and a legal scholar. And so from that angle, what is it that drew you to this topic of happiness, and what drew you to want to write this book, specifically reflecting on Aquinas and Aristotle and their thoughts on happiness? Yeah, just like what drew you to want to write about this topic from your background?
Well, there's two reasons. The first reason is my intellectual interest. Yeah, I am a lawyer and have been a lawyer since 1977. So it's been a long journey of seeing how the legal system has either promoted or destroyed happiness in many of its occupations.
Yeah, that's true.
But I also went, when I was a little bit older, after I had so many, 6 kids, I think it was, I said, I always had a deep interest in St. Thomas and philosophy. I had gotten a master's when I was up at Niagara in education and philosophy, and I was introduced up there by a couple of great Thomists. And I fell in love with St. Thomas there. And then I said, I'm going to go get my PhD in philosophy. Wow. So when I was 49 years old, I got my PhD in philosophy.
Oh my gosh. After you've already been practicing as a lawyer for a few years. That's incredible.
Yeah. So and so what you'll find with me when anybody who kind of searches my bio, my history, is I'm this odd mix of Mr. Practice and Mr. Reality, with Mr. The ideal metaphysical transcendent world right next to it. Because I don't think either thing by itself is all that illustrative for human beings, but I certainly think that reality is something we have to contend with, but we have to do it with a higher measure or a higher series of rules, which come from the transcendent, which come from God. And so I've always seen those two things connected. So that's one of the reasons why my dissertation topic was on how can lawyers and judges rediscover their occupations and live a virtuous role in their occupations instead of being so distressed like they are, because many lawyers are suicidal. Many of them are drunks. They had the highest suicide rate and alcoholism rate of any profession, which doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, me neither.
And so from there, I discovered how St. Thomas has this whole giant discourse on lawyers and judges that most people are not aware of. And then I wrote that text for Prager Press called Aquinas in the Courtroom. And that was the beginning of 5 series of works I did on St. Thomas and how St. Thomas integrates his legal philosophy, his jurisprudence might be a better way of describing it, into the day-to-day grind and practice of law. But I also noted, after the second reason why the book kind of I was driven towards writing the book was watching this precipitous decline in the joy of students that I encountered. I first began my academic career in 1977. Just shows you how ancient I am. At Niagara, at Niagara University up in Niagara Falls, New York. It's a beautiful, beautiful place on the Niagara Gorge, run by the Vincentian Fathers, and it was my first academic appointment. And I always remember how wonderful my students were there, how joyous they were, how the Vincentian Fathers had created an ethos that allowed them to be joyous. And even to this day, the alumni there are fiercely loyal. Their religion still goes on. St. Thomas is still mandatory study. So there's a lot of good things happening at Niagara. But when I left there, I went to a series of public institutions over the next 25 years. And I started to see this steady and precipitous decline in the joy of the students I was encountering. Went up a little bit when I got to a Presbyterian institution called Waynesburg in the early 90s, and stayed there for about 7 or 8 years, but it wasn't quite the same as Niagara. Then I got a job in the State University of New Jersey. Then I went to State University of New York. And then I went to the City University of New York, where John Jay is located. And then I had a chance to come back on sabbatical to go to Franciscan to see what life was like there. And there I encountered these very happy and more joyous students I hadn't seen in a long time. Wow. So in a sense, it's an evolution and de-evolution that is taking place. And I said to myself, why are these people so happy? And yet all the people that I've encountered the last 30 years or so are pretty miserable. There's lots of substance abuse, high levels of suicide, lots of purposelessness, wandering in the desert with no aim or end in sight. And really, that's how young people are in many respects. I encounter them all the time. But when I got to Franciscan, that laboratory experiment came full circle. And I said, I'm going to try to see why it is that these people that I previously encountered are not happy and why the people here aren't happy. And there is where I started to think of the two greatest thinkers in the history of the West, in my mind, who wrote extensively about happiness, of course, starting with Aristotle, the great, probably the greatest eudaimonia thinker that ever lived. And then Thomas knew that as well. He called him the philosopher. He was the greatest thinker in his mind as well. And then, of course, Thomas wrote a treatise on happiness. Everything he does is about happiness. And so I said, I'm going to get their rules and I'm going to lay them out in a way where young people, and this book is addressed, Finding Happiness is addressed to college and high school students. It's not written at a level for PhD students in philosophy. It's not. It's written to show them there is a path, there is a recipe, there is a way. I have a guy named Aristotle who's 15 and a half centuries before Thomas. And then I got Thomas who's 7 centuries ago. And if you just follow the rules, you'll be happy. And that's really what the promise is. And I'm not saying that everything's going to be perfect, but it's a base series of rules and propositions for how to have a contented existence. And I think it works. And that's why I wrote the book, because I want to try to provide them with something to grab onto as we continue to be thrown overboard in a culture run amok.
Yeah. So when you can make those comparisons between the students that you saw in the state schools that you were at versus the students that you saw at Franciscan, at Niagara, what were the differences and what are some of the key differences that you noticed in terms of what contributed to that purposelessness or what contributed to having meaning and having happiness in life?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is the godlessness of these secular institutions. They operate as if you're. I used to kiddingly say this, but I get a lot of trouble for it from some of my colleagues. But the City University of New York, is CUNY. I always used to call it the Communist University of New York because their value system, whether they understand it or not, is very, very valueless. Right. There is absolutely nothing in the culture of these institutions that could uplift anybody. It's all about your own special interest, what you want, what you can get. It's all about individual preferences. There are no universal truths. There's no certitude. There's nothing to grab onto. It's like being on the Titanic all the time. And I think that's number one. So it's a godless empire in these other places. And number two, when you don't believe in the afterlife and you don't believe in anything beyond the here and the now, you're never going to be happy. That's the other thing that comes out of Aristotle and St. Thomas, that you may be temporarily joyous, but you're not happy until you do grab onto the metaphysical.
Well, tease that out for me a little bit. I mean, like, as two Catholics here, two believing Christians, we're talking, of course, obviously anybody listening would expect us to be like, yeah, of course, without God, we don't find happiness. But like, but why? Like, what is a more, I guess, rational argument for that? Like, why is that the case? That without God, we can't be happy.
Well, because everything that is temporal, or everything's on planet Earth, and that's what the finding happiness does, is it takes you through every single temporal experience, whether it's fame, whether it's money, whether it's sex, whether it's hedonism, whether it's pleasure, whether it's power. All those things people come empty-handed of. Every one of them. None of them ever really completely work. Mm-hmm. They always will leave you looking around for more, because it's an endless gravitational pull that can never really be met or felt or stopped. And you can't do anything about it until you reach the ultimate end of human existence, which is a close association with the God that created you. And in the secular world, those ideas are verboten. You're not allowed to consider the metaphysical dimensions of human life. You're forced to stay in the here and the now, and to think to yourself that you're going to be happy because everything from I'm a transgendered student, this is going to happen, and now I'm going to be happy, or I'm a person who just got 10 scholarships to a college for football, that's going to make me happy. None of those things will make you happy. They may be transitorily joyous for you to get for the second, but they evaporate, they dissipate, they vanish. They don't have the capacity to make anybody happy. Mm-hmm. So that's the comparison between the metaphysics. And that's the other thing that's in finding happiness, is I'm continuously talking about spiritual orders, like the nun study and the Benedictine monk study from Germany, and why these people don't seem to have any distress at all. And I think that's a fascinating illustration about the proper ends and goals and aims of the human life and the human person, that when you value the things that are correct, you will never be distressed, no matter how bad things get. Yeah, you may be sad. That's another thing that, that students today don't understand. They think they're supposed to be happy all the time.
Right.
That's not possible. You cannot be happy all the time. Or you, as Thomas says, you would not even know what happiness is if you weren't sad. Mm-hmm. You have to have either the valley or the peak. You have to see both things. You got to walk out and walk down from it. And I think that's why these institutions are going nowhere in the end. In the end, they're suffering from their own myopic view of human existence. Mm-hmm. I think people are starting to rediscover things like Catholic schools, who value the human person, not because you're nice and I'm nice, but they value the human person because God created the human person. Mm-hmm. That's why. Mm-hmm. That's a completely different metaphysical dimension than you'll encounter in any public school, anytime.
Yeah, they just ignore it, altogether.
Right.
And ignoring it, like you said, have a myopic view of the person that's ultimately materialistic. And
it's all materialism.
And the basis for it, unfortunately, is, well, not the basis, the outcomes of it, of course, are deeply unfortunate. I mean, if and I know you talk about suicide and anxiety and stuff that you've been seeing, of course, but you talk about it in the book, and it's right here. And a lot of the latest research continues to support that. And teenagers, and particularly teenage women, the anxiety rates are super high. I think something like 57% at this point. 30% of young women have admitted to having some type of suicide ideation. And I look at that and I say, my goodness, it's like 50 years, 60 years of promoting postmodernism, and there's an inherent meaninglessness to life. Well, what do you think is going to happen? If we just divorce ourselves from the objective truth, and we simply say that we're left to our own devices, and if we just will it enough, or create it enough, or conjure it up enough, or craft it enough, that then we can kind of get back to something. But like, as you stated, there's no shared reality in that. There's no community in that. You're stuck in your own individualism in that. There's nothing that anchors you beyond when those tough times show up. And so repeatedly, it's like without something more to anchor us, without that deeper truth that we are created by a God who loves us, it's awfully difficult to navigate the challenges of life. And it's awfully difficult to look at them and to say there's still purpose in this. And so even like Viktor Frankl, who was some type of religion, he was always queer. His wife was a devout Catholic. But he was quick to, well, he never really disclosed kind of what faith he practiced openly, because he didn't want the religious side to take away from his theory. But nevertheless, the theory, of course, is positing this logotherapy, and is positing that we, without this sense of meaning, without the sense of purpose that we don't just conjure up, but if we aren't connected to something larger than ourselves, then we're going to be aimless. We're going to be aimless, and unfortunately, we try to find things, but it's never going to be enough. And so,
that's beautifully said. I mean, I couldn't argue with one word of that discourse. It's a Sisyphus pushing a rock up a hill. That's all it is. It'll always come back down on you because you can't get enough. It's just not. And I have a great deal of discussion in the finding happiness about entertainers and sports figures, and the so-called people who are the paparazzi's trophies. They couldn't be more distressed. And the ones that aren't, I even have in there. The ones that tend to be happier are the ones who give themselves to others, who live selfless lives. I actually mentioned in the text, probably giving them free press, and I don't care one way or the other, but Gary Sinise is an actor, and he's a wonderful actor. He's been in many good movies. I like his movies. I don't like many movies, believe me, but I do like him. But he has this charity that he runs for veterans. It's called the Lieutenant Dan Band. He goes around playing for all the veterans that are crippled from all the wars. And he spends his whole life doing this. He says, I've never been happier because he gives himself to others. He puts himself outside. That image that you just poetically painted of young girls having no self-image and don't like what they look like. And you talk about being captured in the world of non-reality, of non-beauty, of non-goodness. I mean, this whole world of the phone and TikTok and what it's doing to young people is all part of the same destruction.
Yeah, it is.
Never going to get enough. It'll just get worse.
So two comments here. One, to the celebrity piece, there's a quote by Jim Carrey that says, "I wish everybody could be rich and famous so that everybody would know it's not the answer."
That's true.
It ain't the answer to the problem. Okay, so he's making that very clear. And then the second piece is just what you're talking about with TikTok and stuff. I mean, and it's only going to get worse. I've just seen recently. I saw this on something pop up. With regards to these augmented reality filters that you can put on. That basically, like, we're having a conversation right now, but I could put some filter on that would basically make me look like somebody else. Or if I'm a 16-year-old girl, I can put this beauty filter on that makes me look like a supermodel. I mean, it's like, how do you even compete with that? How do you even know what's real anymore when you're having conversations with people? I'm actually just a chatbot. You didn't even know that. I'm not really a person. It's this.
You better not.
I'm a Catholic chatbot. That's what
I understand that completely.
So we've been talking a little bit about, obviously, what constitutes, how do we get happiness in the world versus kind of the teachings here, but we'll get back to that, I'm sure, in a little bit. But let's just kind of define our terms. Okay, so how do we define happiness? What is happiness? How does Aristotle define it? How does Aquinas define it? What's our term here? What do we mean?
Well, I can tell you, I always contrast happiness inside of Aristotle's mean. It is neither endless desolation, nor is it boundless exhilaration. You have to find the middle of those 2 points, time and space. And I call it contentment. He kind of calls it that as well. And I agree with that. So many people today think that happiness is a synonym for joy and constant, frenetic exuberance, that everything's great. If you're always like that, you belong in a mental hospital. There's something wrong with you. In the same way that something's wrong with somebody who's constantly desolate or despondent. Those 2 things are the excess and defect of Aristotelian thinking and Thomistic thinking on what the nature of happiness is. So I think the best term I can apply to it is human contentment in human operations. You know what your place is, you know what your purpose is, you know what your end is. You never are alone in that, and that you value the things that all coincide with the ultimate purpose of human life. That's a happy person.
Mm-hmm.
It's the people gravitating and grabbing at straws all the time, trying to get happy, but they never will, because they again, they're like Sisyphus pushing a rock up a hill. They're never going to be content. It's impossible for them. In the same way that a drug addict or a sexual addict or whatever, they're never going to be happy. It's impossible. So that's my definition. It's not a exciting one. It's based on, the principle of eudaimonia that comes from Aristotle. It's not, but it's kind of what you would say an anti-psychiatric or psychological type of definition,
Mm-hmm.
which tends to want some kind of euphoria, and and that's why they prescribe so many medications, so you'll feel happier. Well, that's not going to do it either. So medications don't make people happy. They just mask the sadness. That's all they do. So that's my definition of that. I don't know if that works for you.
Yeah, so we're talking about contentment is what you said. A sense of kind of acceptance and contentment, not being, manic all the time. And what was the other pole you said? It was
like a desolation,
not being desolation.
A despondency,
exactly.
Eternal.
Yeah. So finding the middle ground between both of those,
right.
And that would be the happy person, the person who's come to, I would say, a certain acceptance of one's limitations, while at the same time a certain acceptance of one's capacities, and being able to harbor or navigate both of those would be where we would say that is a happy person.
Yeah, and I find that the virtue of long suffering is a great illustration of this. I mean, people who have a child that's dying of cancer, or a spouse that dies young, or some tragedy takes place in a person's life, and then for most of us, it'll devastate us. It's going to devastate no matter how you cut it, but it's how you recover from it, how you see the tragedy in light of our faith, Catholicism's aim and purpose. And, that human suffering is part of human existence. And a lot of our efforts in the contemporary, you called it postmodernism. I think we're past that. I think we're in the post deconstructionist period right now. Right. Suffering is not to be tolerated, but yet suffering is what makes the person in many respects. I don't know if you've ever met anybody who can withstand suffering at levels you and I probably couldn't. It is a remarkable courageousness that a lot of people simply don't have, and yet they are content with themselves because they prize the right things. And so, I think
sure. Yeah. I mean,
we call it navigation. It is a form of navigation. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. I mean, and we're seeing that more and more now with the suffering, that we've accepted comfort as being the ultimate good. But now you're seeing all sorts of studies about fasting, helping people, taking cold showers, in the shock value, helping longevity. I mean, things that intentionally force us to turn on the systems in our body to activate a little bit of suffering actually is healthy for us. So we get that at the physical. We're seeing this now in the physical realm. And then even in marriages, we understand that there's you can't just be happy all the time. There's going to be moments where there's friction that happens between a couple. And it's not that arguments in themselves are an indication of health in a relationship. It's rather how couples navigate those arguments that indicates their health. Right. And so, if they're just placating and sweeping things under the rug, good luck. 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line, it's going to blow up. It's going to come out. But if you've learned how to navigate those challenges along the way, that little suffering that we spoke about as an analogy here, then couples who do that are the couples who end up being happier in the long run.
That's beautifully said. I of course, have been married 51 years.
You understand what I'm talking about.
Oh, I was going to recommend the Vatican canonize my wife because I can't believe she's has put up with me all these years. But
amen.
We do have our scraps, and when I meet people that say, we've never fought once in all the years. I said, well, you're a liar.
You're a liar. Exactly. Or there's a lot slipped under the rug.
Yeah. You're hiding something, right?
Exactly. And hiding it, thinking that that's what's going to make happiness isn't the answer
No,
either.
no.
So, okay, so let's go to Seligman here for a segment. So I'll give you the psychological answer here. Okay. So Martin Seligman, for those who don't know, is a psychologist. Over about 20-something years ago, he was the president of the APA, and his kind of claim to fame within the psychological community is that he brought about this notion of positive psychology. And what he saw in his research was that psychology was doing a wonderful job of understanding problems and getting people to a sense of normalcy, stability. But psychology was not answering the bigger question, or not trying to move people to say, well, what does it actually mean to be happy? What does it actually mean to live a good life? What does that actually mean to not just be miserable? It's not just enough to satisfy our anxiety or satisfy our depression or quench our psychosis. That just brings us back to some stability. How do we take that stability and move forward? And so there's the positive element of it, not just answering in the negative, but in the positive moving forward. And so he set out and did exactly similar. He has great books on the virtues, and he came up with like 3 classifications of happiness. And he says there is what we would call the pleasant life, and this is kind of what we've been talking about, is the pursuit of comfort. It says that in of itself isn't going to make one happy. We can get stuck in what he refers to as a hedonic treadmill, where we're just pursuing one hedonic activity after another. And we're just thinking that comfort alone is going to be the thing that's going to make us happy. And the pleasant life ultimately falls short. That's what he says. The second level of that would be the good life, where we've come to understand some strength or some virtue that we have. And we know those things, we kind of operate out of them, and that's good. But it has to go a step further, and the further step has to be the meaningful life, where we understand with meaning and purpose what those strengths and virtues actually mean and where we can actually apply them. And people who live a good life, but even more so people who live a meaningful life, is 100% positively correlated with individuals that are happy. And so this is similar to what you wrote about here. So I'm going to quote you here directly, if I may. Speaking about Aquinas and Aristotle, and this is page 45 of your book, you say, Aristotle and Aquinas provide a timeless formula for how to achieve a happy state. Aside from encouraging reasonable expectations as to its achievements while living in the world, both urge seekers of happiness to understand what it means to be happy. In place of a perpetual exhilaration, this comes we were already talking about earlier, and feeling of an endless emotional high, each urges that happiness is to be more of a state of contentment, a condition of excellence, a mark of achievement at the various highest levels of potential. Basically, this life consists of and encompasses every activity that can be described as virtuous. And this is important, and you go on to say this, because when we look at it as virtue, happiness is within our grasp. It's possible. It's not something that's illusionary. It's not just for the individuals who are born with extra money, or who are born famous, or born with a certain set of looks or a certain skill set. No, happiness is potential for all of us, because we are choosing then to live this virtuous life. The research, Seligman 100% agrees with that. 100% agrees with that, and this notion of what positive psychology is contributing to this conversation.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you've given it a more contemporary feel than Aristotle might, but and Thomas certainly are both. They're both of the 2 greatest, not only happiness thinkers. They see a correlation between happiness and virtue. Mm-hmm. I always tell my students over the years, give me one person who has a vice that is a happy person. Has an extreme vice. All of us have vices, but
sure.
When I teach about prostitution, and I always say to them, name a happy prostitute. What are their lives like? Name mm-hmm. a happy drug addict. Name a happy multiple felonious actor. Mm-hmm. They're never happy. They're all miserable. Their lives are all shaped by vice. They're not shaped by virtue, and everything they pick is always in opposition to the ends and goals they were put here for in the first place. Mm-hmm. Nothing that a vice-ridden person does is lawful. It's always unlawful. And it's always contrary to their own internal sense of justice. It's always opposed to their natural instincts. It's always opposed to the natural law imprint that God has embedded in every human person. Even the Romans knew that. One of the books I've written over the past is a book on Cicero and St. Thomas. And it was called A Comparison of Nature and the Natural Law between these 2 figures. And in the end, they both get to the same place because they look at what our nature is, how we're supposed to live, what should we be doing, things in compatibility with our nature, or should we be acting in contravention to our nature?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the latter case, you will be distressed. In the former case, if you're living in accordance with your nature, and that is always virtuous living, you will always be happy.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is one of the requirements of being happy, and that is to not just get control of your feelings, but it's a life of action. It's a life of virtuous action. You have to have a disposition that is inclined towards all the great virtues, and most people that are virtuous are extremely happy people.
Mm-hmm. Obviously I'm a therapist, and so I work a lot with folks who struggle with depression, struggle with anxiety. As you said earlier, the medicine doesn't make you happy. I agree with that 100%. The way I describe it to my clients is that the medicine, it kind of raises the floor a little bit, and so if you're bottoming out, and bottoming out, it's difficult. It's hard to make sound decisions when you bottom out. It's hard to act when you've bottomed out. You have no energy. It feels like sludge. It's difficult to engage. And so what the medicine does, as I understand it, is that it just kind of raises the floor a little bit. And so even if you raise the floor 10%, where you have somebody, if you're bottoming out, but you're not bottoming out as low as you normally would, well, that extra 10% gives you just a little bit more energy to re-engage back within your life. And so if you look at the medicine as something, as a tool, and it can be a temporary tool, some people have to be on it long term, but some people can be on it just for in the short term, just to be able to give them enough of an energy to get back in and engage, and to be thinking and engaging and making those decisions in their life that can then set them back up in a positive spiral, positive movement forward. And then from there, they can get off of it if they need to and continue to move forward with their lives and have some clarity in the thinking. Because when people bottom out, it's really challenging. And yeah. It ends up feeling, especially when you're really lost, when you're lost in the throes of a vice, certainly, but then even lost in the throes of a mental condition, a difficulty, it feels difficult to know how to begin getting out of this. And that's why I can't stress enough for people who are genuinely unhappy and struggling with happiness in their life to start small and to make little changes. If you're struggling with overeating or drinking or compulsive sex behavior, something of that nature, like, you're not going to just be able to stop cold turkey in those things. Like, it takes little moments where there's little decisions where you keep having these conversions, and these little moments where you just kind of take it one step and then you build some momentum in and you keep going. And momentum moves in both directions. And that's the beautiful thing about this, is that if anybody feels like they're in sludge, you take one step forward and then the next thing presents itself, and then the next thing, and you kind of keep building on that, and not get discouraged by the fact that you're moving, but that you're not where you need to be, but trying to see that you're taking the appropriate steps forward. Which is another way of what we've been talking about when we say virtue, is that virtue isn't this firm disposition towards the good, doesn't just happen overnight. It's right. It's a lifelong process.
Well said. The other thing that's so positive about Aristotle and Thomas on virtue is that it's never hopeless. It's a very optimistic vision of the human person. You're not fixed in these habits or these behaviors. In fact, all virtue and vice are nothing but habits. Right. They're not universally embedded. They're not things that you can't adjust or change, but it doesn't mean it's easy. Anybody who has any vices knows how hard it is to change these things. But there's always, to me, underlying at both Aristotle and Thomas, this optimistic vision of the power of the human person to come out of the valley, so to speak, and conquer it a little bit at a time. I think your advice on not trying to do it all cold turkey is brilliant, because most of the vices people have do take years to unravel from.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
very true.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's the line? It's in The Princess Bride. I just lost what he says. When after he defeats the have you seen The Princess Bride? You know what I'm talking about? That old movie.
Yeah, I do remember. I don't remember what you're going to quote.
Yeah, so I'm about to quote, if I can remember correctly. After he does the duel of wits with the Sicilian, about like the poison in the glass, and he ends up, the guy dies, and he's like, he has like the princess, and he says something like, whoever whoever's trying to make you happy or sell you is just lying to you. I just ruined it. Darn it. I just freaking ruined it. I'm going to get back on this. All right, everybody. I'm going to get this quote right. All right. I just ruined it. Look for the comments later. Hey everybody, this is Dr. Mario Sacasa, just taking a quick break from my conversation with Dr. Charles Nemeth to encourage you to come on one of our upcoming Faith and Marriage retreats at the St. Joseph Abbey Retreat Center in Covington, Louisiana. I know for some of you that is an easy trip to get to. For others, I know it's a little bit further away. No problem. If you're able to make it for one of our upcoming retreats, we would love to have you. On our retreats, we really try to find a balance between time together as couple, time together for the whole community to be able to share, and also beautiful time in prayer. So we try to have some fun, try to encourage couples to engage on different levels, but really what our desire is for this weekend to be an opportunity for you and your spouse to grow closer together and to be able to grow closer to the Lord. And so if you want to learn more about our upcoming retreats, head on over to faithandmarriage.org. So when we talk about, happiness broadly, in the book, you get into some particular areas where we have set up and believe that happiness can be found. And there's virtue in each of these. And so when we talk about material possession, there's virtue there. Fame, bodily pleasure, relationships, and spiritual beliefs, of course. But the three big ones here that I want to kind of tackle with the time that we have left is material possessions, relationships, and then kind of even just comfort, when we think about comfort. So when it comes to material possessions, first and foremost, there of course is a line with this. And it used to be, and I know you reference this in the book, that it's like, it used to be, I think what the number was like $75,000 a salary a year, or something like that. I don't think it's that now with inflation, but we'll just go with that, what it is right now. That it was like, if you can have enough money to pay your bills, to have a roof over your head, to have the essentials, that's the line where money and happiness kind of correlate. Anything above that no longer contributes, any higher salary above that no longer contributes to your overall health and happiness. And the way I've kind of come to kind of think about this is there's a larger difference between not having a car and having a 2005 Honda Accord versus having a 2005 Honda Accord and having a 2023 Lexus. Like not having a car is far more detrimental than having an old beater, as compared to having a luxury car. And so often we think that money is in possessions is what's going to make us happy. But there is a limit. There's a place where we can say certainly having a certain amount of money to be able to provide for ourselves and having a certain degree of safety and comfort in material possessions to provide for us are great. But there comes a point where it no longer is helping us to achieve our happiness. And so when we think about material possessions, what more can you add to that? Like where is the virtue in that space? Where is the line where we say we need some of it, or do we not need any of it, or falling into excess in it as well?
There's a lot of comments can be made about that. Certainly, you mentioned the $75,000 salary. I think there's a study. I'm positive there's a study in the chapter on materialism and money, which says 170,000 is the new figure. Wow. It's a Norwegian study. So once you go over 170,000, then the problems start to accelerate. Wow. Okay. On the other hand, there are other people who say if you use the money for good purpose, this is one of my big critiques of rich Catholics, that we have never had a great Catholic benefactor who went, like a billionaire, 100 millionaire type Catholic. We have them who would walk around and say, I'm going to save every Catholic school that's struggling. In other words, I was like, I'm picking on Ted Kennedy. He's not here anymore, but I'll pick on him anyway. He had all that money in his family, but they never once helped one Catholic school stay afloat. They never gave $1 to any of them. And to me, I'm going to put
in a counter this real quick. Just out of New Orleans, where we had I will actually say we've had a few very rich Catholics who have been very generous.
That's good.
Particularly Gail Benson, who comes to mind, and who's the owner of the Saints and the Pelicans franchise. Her husband Tom and her have given millions of dollars to cancer research, to Notre Dame Seminary, to Jesuit High School, to Brother Martin High School. I mean, she has basically said she doesn't have any heirs. And so when she dies, the sale of the franchise, the money that happens is going to the city. She's leaving it in her will that she doesn't have any kids. And so it's going to go to philanthropic
that's a great story.
So there's the one, right? So
well, I'm sure there's others.
I'm sure there's others too. I don't mean to.
But I'm just saying that there are enough well-heeled Catholics on Wall Street that might, when they see a Catholic school is ready to close, why don't they just walk in there and say, we're keeping it open? Something like that. And I think it doesn't matter how much money you make if you're using it for good purposes. But what happens is that they make all this money and they don't use it for good purposes. They buy 12 cars. They buy 9 houses. They have, 15 resorts, one in France, one in Florida. And then it just becomes an endless grab bag, thinking that every one of these things is going to make you happy, and they don't. So, there's nothing wrong with money. There's nothing wrong. And there's certainly something wrong with being destitute. There is, to have nothing is not a virtuous lifestyle either.
Awful.
So there is a balance again between greed and, complete poverty. I think it's a hard question to answer, but I do know that all the people who do have money tend to squander it. Look at the studies I put in here about athletes.
Yep. It's unfortunate.
Every league within 3 years after they retire, they're over 70% of them, NHL, NBA, NFL, they're all bankrupt. What they do with their money, all the money they make, that's the largest transference of wealth to any group of people who really are not necessarily highly educated, highly qualified, except in athletics. And what do they do with their money? Well, they squander it, and then they get all sad, and then they drink, and then they get into drugs. It's a cycle that you see play out over and over and over because they didn't do anything good with their money.
Yeah, and I'll say
things they could have done good things with their money.
They could have, and what also happens is that they also get taken advantage of because of their youth. And so, like, I've had some people that I've known who've played professionally, and what ends up happening is that, like, almost immediately you start getting phone calls from your 5th cousin that you haven't seen,
right?
And your 12th uncle, who everybody finds and everybody wants a piece of the pie, and you're a 19-year-old. And what was that?
It's like lottery winners.
Exactly.
They're a very depressed group too.
Yeah. And so you're 20-something years old, and all of a sudden you've gotten this wealth, and no one's taught you how to handle money, and no one's taught you how to navigate this and how to set boundaries, or you think you're investing in somebody who you thought was honorable and they aren't, and they cheated you, and all of a sudden you're out $5 million in some investment that you thought. I mean, these type of stories, it's repeated. So some of it, of course, is that they squander it and they don't know how to spend it appropriately. Some of it's also that they get taken advantage of also.
There's no doubt about that.
Because they don't have. And so the leagues, I know, like the NBA particularly, I know is trying to do what it can to help and educate these guys how to manage that a little bit better. So that hopefully those stats, are decrease. I would say for myself, as I've thought about my own relationship with material possessions, if we come to, because I can fall easily into the trap of, ooh, look at that shiny new thing. Like I'm a tech guy. I love it. You know what I mean? The latest thing comes, I'm like, oh man, that thing looks awesome. Oh man, that thing looks awesome. And I easily can fall susceptible to, savvy marketing and commercialism. And what I've kind of come to is recognizing firmly that, like, if all these things that we have are simply just tools. And I think this is what Jim Collins, I don't know if you ever read Good to Great, it's kind of a business book. One of the things he says is that technology in itself isn't going to be what makes your company better. Similar in our life, technology in itself isn't what's going to make our lives better, or devices or clothes or whatever those things are. But if we can look at them as tools, then what do they help us achieve? And if you're a fitness person and having a good fitness watch is going to help you kind of achieve certain goals, then great. Okay, no problem. If you're a student and you need a computer that works so that you can do the research that you need to do, okay, wonderful. What is the end with this? And I think that is a question that needs to be, kind of monitored with when we start evaluating material possessions. And so, like, if we have 7 kids, well, you know what? You're not going to be able to live in a 2-bedroom home. Like, that's just not going to happen. Like, so you need to be able to have a certain amount of income and consider where you're going to live so that you can have space for everybody. So things like that, of course, there is a place where material possessions can help us. But again, as we've been stating, when it becomes an end to itself, or greed takes over, or we're squandering it, or it's just for vanity or just for those things, then that's when we lose the way. But there is a place here where we can kind of grow. And so encouraging people to kind of spend a little bit of time thinking about, purchases that they're considering.
Absolutely. The shop to drop crowd is never happy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You think of like Black Friday and all that stuff, people just kind of trampling other folks just because of it. Anyways. Okay. So then let's move into relationships. That's an area that you talk about in the book as well. I do a lot with dating, and I've had the pleasure of speaking at a couple college campuses here recently to talk about dating, and these questions come up often. And there is a balance where we can make marriage an idol. And I think that's the answer, is that we can put too much pressure in expecting that to be the one thing that's going to make me happy. At the same time, though, and so we could fall into that, which of course is problematic when we fall into some idolatry, some false notion of what marriage is or who the person is. But at the same time, like, we also know the research supports very clearly that married couples are happier, are healthier, have sex more frequently than their single counterparts, just across the board. Like, marriage, even today in 2023, is a better prospect than being single. So again, as we've been talking about virtue, what's the balance with this? What's the balance in terms of saying marriage and having stability in a long-term committed relationship is healthy and important without making it or turning it into an idol?
That's a very fascinating question. I think one of the things I point out in the text is that people who live together before they get married
Mm-hmm.
and live for some period over 7 months, I think one of the studies notes, are 7 times more likely to get divorced than those who simply get married. Now, I don't think that's idolizing marriage.
Mm-hmm.
I think what that does is give the proper parameters for human sexuality between men and women. It allows them to, to have the context of why these things are done in the first place. And it displaces this hedonistic idea, this Epicurean idea that dating and sex and pleasure are just as legitimate as a marital state where sexuality drives towards having children.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't consider any of that to be idolizing. I think it's very practical when you look at how long married people live compared to how long unmarried people live. It's the same argument we made about people that believe versus people that don't. Non-believers die younger than believers die. So, and on the other hand, I'm not in favor of this kind of, I call it the Amish factor. Sometimes you'll find this, in certain traditional, I wouldn't even call them traditional Catholics, but they're trying to shield their children from having any kind of sexual attraction to the opposite sex.
Yeah, good luck.
It's patently absurd.
Yeah.
What you're doing is you're thwarting the natural order. You're destroying what God intends you to do in the end. Not to have promiscuous sexuality. I'm not saying that, but to try to set up bubbles for your children where they never experience the attraction or affection or physical touch of the opposite sex is bound to lead to distress, not to happiness. So, but there are contexts to that. And I mean, you can't be an individual that dates like Will Chamberlain did,
boasted proudly 10,000 women or whatever it was.
I said this, excuse me. I said this in a class a couple of days ago. I said he had put down that he had sexual relations with 11,000 women. And one of my students said, "No, Dr. Nemeth, that's been updated to 18,000. I said, well, how's that man even walking? but in any event, that's all out of the normal context of human affairs. Right. Everything has to be balanced. It is the old expression of Aristotle, all things in moderation are what are good. Not everything, but almost everything should be measured by the mean. And I And I think marriage is the perfect institution to provide the mean for happiness in relationships, because the rest of it, in the end, objectifies people. It turns them into non-beings, and it uses people as tools and artifices rather than seeing them as part of the grand plan of God's creation.
Yep. So a couple thoughts here on what you said beautifully. Thank you. So the first piece of this kind of bubble mentality, it also is, it's the opposite of virtue, because if we don't let our kids have some exposure, again, we're not saying show them pornography, that's not what I'm saying at all,
Right.
But if they've never had to contend with those attractions, then how can they ever cultivate the virtues that they need? That's part of the problem here, is that like they have to have some cultivation of like, I got to know how that, when I'm watching a show and an image pops up, or if I'm walking down the street and there's a girl, if I've never had to contend with that feeling of arousal before, and to know how to be able to navigate that and bring that to the Lord rather than just, objectifying that individual, then we're setting them up for failure. Like, because adulthood is, they're going to have to navigate those feelings at some point or another. Let's teach them how to do that, as preteens and as teenagers. The problem is in our world is that we've gone to the other extreme, which is just, well, if you got it, do it. You got that feeling, so you're supposed to engage. You got that itch, scratch it, baby. That's what you're supposed to do. That's like, that's bad advice also. But the completely repressive one is equally problematic. And then the other piece, when you talked about the studies of couples who live together in the higher divorce, whenever we say that, and that's been the case, that research has been consistent for 20 years now. And everybody's always still dumbfounded by it. They're like, how is that the case? Well, we'll tell you how it's the case. Because there's a fundamentally different attitude that you have when you are roommates versus when you are married. And the difference is this: when you are just living together, you're not divorced at that point, separation is an option. And when you have been together for 7-8 years, and that becomes the habit that you have formed in your marriage, in your relationship, to just switch that in marriage, or to think that thought is just going to go away, it doesn't go away. Like, if you've set that up as the pattern of behavior and the pattern of interactions, you bring that into a marriage, well, then exit is always going to be an option. And that's the difference, is that couples who go right into marriage know from the get-go that separation isn't an option. There's no backup plan here. There's not a trial thing that we're just going to be testing each other out, like as if we're cars, that we're just test driving for a few months. It's like we're in it, and then we're going to figure this thing out. That mentality is one that indicates success, and the other, doesn't. And so, again, it's a matter of
Yep.
What are we doing here? What are we trying to accomplish?
Yep, absolutely. So the other thing too is both Thomas and Aristotle don't see sexuality as a negative, and Catholics are all so often accused of supposedly hating sex. Which to me is,
we're not sex positive, as they say, right?
right. And I always tell people, well, you remember the Industrial Revolution? How did those people? I had 7 kids, but I'm a mere piker when you compare it to like Antonin Scalia's family, or my great grandfather's family. They had 14 kids. I mean, that doesn't happen because you think it. There's a lot of physical activity involved in that. So I always tell students when we talk about these topics that, this is not something dirty. This is something beautiful. It's supposed to be this way. Otherwise, we'd be extinct if we did not have pleasure and joy and wonder from it, and our affection for the opposite sex. We would not have a population. So it's God's mystical plan, how he does everything. It's always astounding to me how everything always makes sense when you sit back and think on it.
Yeah.
And that's what's wrong with the modern world. So much of what we do, no one's thinking at all. They're feeling.
Oh, you mean Twitter isn't a place for in-depth conversation?
Oh, yeah.
So this has been wonderful. If people are interested in getting the book, Finding Happiness in a Complex World, how can they get a hold of it? If they want to get a hold of you specifically, how can they learn more about the work you're doing?
You can certainly find me at franciscanuniversity.com and click my name. It'll come up. And the book you can get at sophiainstitutepress.com. It's a wonderful press. They've done wonderful work to help get the word out. And I'm happy to come back and visit with you anytime. I can be. I have a lot of different shows I can do, particularly anything that relates to crime and justice, law, Supreme Court rulings, things like that. So,
Sounds great.
yeah. I also run a center at Franciscan called the Center for Criminal Justice, Law, and Ethics.
Yeah.
And we educate lawyers and judges and police officers on a lot of these
That's
topics.
awesome. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that, Chuck, and I may
Mario,
take you up
thank
on
you
that.
very much.
So, final question I ask all my first-time guests: what gives you hope?
When I teach my students, I walk out every day saying it's not over yet.
Amen.
My student, I tell them every day that I'm out to pasture in another 7 or 8 years or 5 years or whatever. But this is your world, and you're the ones who are going to change it because it's a mess. And one of the reasons that I got criminal justice started at Franciscan is because we wanted this opportunity to put our faith into action. And that's what the board has been pushing, not just studying theology, which is wonderful. I love theology and philosophy, but how do we go out there and put the Franciscan imprint on these institutions that we're contending with, whether it's in hospitals or schools and now it's in the criminal justice. We're only 2 years old and we're already making a huge impact. So that's why I'm optimistic, because I think our graduates are going to go out into the world and shake the tree mightily.
Yeah. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Well, Chuck, thanks so much for joining me on the program.
Thank you, Marion.
All right, everybody. Well, that does it for our conversation here today with Dr. Charles Nemeth. So grateful for him and for his time and for the expertise that he offers. Certainly, this is a topic where I've done previous episodes about and we'll probably do future episodes on, because we can never quite learn enough about what it means to be happy. And so I reiterate what I stated in the show, that if you are struggling with happiness, just please find one small step, one small change that you can make in your life to move towards self-improvement. We can't tackle all the problems that we are experiencing at the same time, but we can have a sense of strategy and to be able to work on one issue at a time, which will, over the course of a period, will be able to help us to be able to achieve the happiness in the life that we are hoping to be able to live. So many blessings to you on this journey. Thank you guys for checking out the show and hanging with me all the way to the end. God bless you and have a great day.